Thanks, Max. I'm pleased to be here. I've had the great opportunity to work with school districts for almost 20 years as a support partner and as a researcher. In my various roles, I have worked with central office leaders all across the organization who consistently tell me and show me two things. One, they're deeply committed to doing their part to help schools serve all students well. Most recently, what some of them mean by serving schools well is that they want to help principals be successful at leading for better instruction in every classroom. But, and this is their second point, they don't always have the information they need to get better at what they do in terms of school support. For example, many are hungry for information about what best practices are for central office staff, and they're looking for some regular data to tell them if they're on the right track. But too often that information is in short supply, or they have so much information, but not the time to sort through what is and isn't useful. As one central office leader told us, there's so much information and a real data collection opportunity, and I just haven't had the capacity to be able to incorporate those data into decisions. But they were, in their words, always working to find the right information and the right amount of time to use it. So this webinar is about these two interrelated issues. First, what we know about how central offices help principals grow as instructional leaders. And second, what data and really well-developed performance management systems have to do with helping central offices actually get better at principal support. I've organized this webinar into three parts. In the first part, I'll talk about what we've learned about what central offices do when they focus on principal support, and also how they use data to support their work. I'll talk about what's challenging about using data to improve central office performance, especially when it comes to principal support, and I'll suggest some next steps. Some key points I'll make include that when school systems meaningfully improve what they do in terms of principal support, they really engage in some fairly significant change that we call central office transformation. And I'll share with you three main avenues of work that they pursue to improve their performance. To support their improved performance, they build what we call true performance management systems. And I'll define what makes performance management systems true performance management systems, or ones that actually support the work. And I will talk about how districts that move in these directions tackle some key barriers to working well with data, and they tackle them head on. And the three I'll discuss today are lack of clarity in terms of roles, both for school principals and central office staff, shortages of data, especially relevant data to help inform central office improvement, and the lack of support for central office staff and actually using data to get better. And I'll conclude by sharing with you how the systems we've worked with have really meaningfully engaged new forms of leadership as well as tools and systems to work with data in ways that improve how they perform in support of improving principals' practice. The ideas I'll share with you today come from a number of sources. Our main source is our research, and we've conducted a major study funded by the Wallace Foundation and followed up on that with another significant study with support from the W.T. Grant Foundation, all of which take very in-depth looks at the day-to-day practices of central office staff that we have found matter to improving supports for schools around better instruction in all classrooms. Our thinking about these ideas from our research is also informed by partnerships we have with both districts and also networks of districts. And we're always getting smarter about these ideas and how to talk about them through the teaching that we do in a number of formats, including through our EDD program, the Leadership for Learning program. So let's get started with what we've learned about central offices that focus on principal support. And let me start with how superintendents talked about what they were doing. And this word transformation was really their word. As one superintendent put it, when I was arrived, it was clear that our goal had to be nothing less than a total district transformation if we were really serious about improving teaching and learning across the entire district. As another put it, they said, "We aim to retool the entire district to support instruction and leadership in the buildings." And a third said that what they were doing, this is not your father's or your grandfather's old school system. And what they were saying is that traditional forms of reform in central offices typically involve restructuring. So they, for example, say, okay, we're not going to have this org chart anymore. We're going to shift to this organizational chart. We're going to shift the titles of different units. We're going to change who they report to. What the leaders of the systems we studied were recognizing was that these traditional forms of improving central office performance were not going to be enough to truly improve the supports available to schools. And they really aimed to build a very different kind of institution. And the mental image I encourage people to have of this kind of reform is that of a blank page. That essentially what these leaders were doing was sitting down with a blank page and asking themselves, what's the school district we would build if from the get-go that system were oriented in terms of everything it does toward the improvement of teaching and learning across the district. And it was interesting that we've looked at very different kinds of districts, but across all of them, they started with a pretty common theory of action. And that theory of action related to the importance of having all principals serve as excellent instructional leaders, based on the premise that that's how you get to high quality teaching in every classroom. And it's when you have high quality teaching in every classroom that a school system is leveraging its most important resources to get all students achieving at high levels. But as I suggested, these district leaders were concerned that the traditional bureaucratic ways of working in the central office were not working to realize these results. And instead, they set out to create a very different kind of system. And I'm going to talk about 3 ideas that anchored what they designed. They first created learning-focused partnerships between central office and school principals, focused on principals' growth as instructional leaders. 2, they remade all the other central office units so that the work of those units was aligned to the improvement of instruction. And 3rd, they led these systems in ways that fostered continuous improvement in those systems. True performance management systems were essential drivers of this work. We know this from research and experience, too, across private business, healthcare industry, higher education, and other areas that show the importance of data and learning from experience to help organizations build their capacity to realize results. True performance management is not just any kind of data system or data-driven decision-making. It starts with meaningful measures. In simple terms, the right things measured with the right data. Too often, despite all the push in federal and state policy for data-driven decision-making, the only data central office staff have available to them are school test scores and maybe some program evaluation information. But what are central office staff doing day to day, and how well is it working to help school principals and teachers realize improvements in teaching and learning for all students? Most central office staff I meet are operating without these basic anchors to their practice. Clear definitions of what their own practice should be when what they're doing matters to the improvement of teaching and learning in schools, and information about close they're actually working toward those target practices. So true performance management systems start with meaningful measures, definitions of roles, and data to track progress toward realizing those roles. Second, true performance management systems don't simply generate data. They also provide staff with supports for using the data to get better. So they're intentionally designed to help staff figure out what data mean and how do they matter for their performance. Let's take a look at a couple of examples together of the 2 things that we're focused on in this webinar. So first, how these systems were transforming to better support principals and ultimately teaching and learning, and how true performance management mattered to the process. First, our districts were trying to wrap new supports around principals to help them be successful. We've written a great deal about this strand of the work, and you can learn much more through our publications and also an online course that's available on our website. But in a nutshell, these systems were concerned that principals were buried in red tape at the bottom of the district hierarchy in ways that frustrated their ability to lead for better instruction. Principal supervision was typically limited to check-ins and evaluations that were very occasional, not ongoing supports that promised to help principals learn how to operate ably as instructional leaders. Our districts aimed to tackle this problem head on by redesigning the role of the principal supervisor so that the supervisor and principal were partners in helping principals grow as instructional leaders. We found this new way of working had at least 3 main features that were important to actually increasing supports for principal growth. For one, these staff, whom we distinguish as with the title Instructional Leadership Directors, or ILDs, the ILDs were dedicated to principal growth. They were supposed to spend as close to 100% of the time as possible working directly with principals or working on work that promised to support principals' growth as instructional leaders. So they were not loaded on with other responsibilities, such as positions on task forces throughout the central office or networking with community organizations. When they were, it took too much time away. Second, these ILDs were executive level staff. They reported directly to the superintendent, or in smaller systems, they were the superintendent themselves. And by elevating the work of principal support, these systems were saying that the work of helping principals get better as instructional leaders is so important, it should be a cabinet level responsibility. And also, it should have the benefit of cabinet level resources to support their work. And third, and probably most important in terms of what our research findings show, ILDs were able to help increase supports for principals' growth as instructional leaders when they approach their work as teaching. And in many of our publications, we go into some great detail to elaborate the specific teaching practices that ILDs engaged in when they helped increase supports for principals' growth and helped principals engage in progressively more challenging instructional leadership activities. True performance management was important to these relationships. Remember, true performance management involves having clear role definitions and standards of working that staff could tie to the improvement of teaching and learning. It also involves having the right data for measuring progress. So consistent with these ideas, a clear definition of the principalship as instructional leadership was an essential support for helping ILDs be successful. This makes intuitive sense, right? How can you help someone get better at their work if you don't have a clear sense of what better work is? We were able to back that good sense up with evidence. The ILDs we associated with positive results related to principals' growth worked from at least their own clear conception of what it meant for their principals to operate as instructional leaders, and they made that definition explicit in their work with principals. Those that we associated with negligible or negative results generally did not use a clear and consistent definition of principal instructional leadership to anchor their work. So our findings were pretty clear-cut on this point. ILDs also looked at multiple sources of evidence to inform their thinking about principals' capacity and their growth. For sure, they were looking at test scores, but they were also routinely observing and documenting how principals went about their work. And they were observing and documenting the quality of teaching in their principal schools as even more proximate indicators of principal performance. When it came to the question about what data were meaningful for measuring principals' performance as instructional leaders, ILDs who were making a demonstrable difference in terms of principal performance were looking at multiple sources of evidence to inform their thinking, and most of those forms of evidence related to professional practice. For sure, they were looking at test scores, but they were also routinely observing and documenting how principals went about their work. And they were observing and documenting the quality of teaching in their principal schools as indicators of principals' performance. For example, several ILDs in one district regularly gathered and used evidence about their principals' development as instructional leaders. This evidence included school scores on standardized tests, but also their own observations, for example, of how principals prioritize their time on teaching and learning, and their principals' ability to observe and analyze teachers during classroom observations. One ILD showed us a sort of data dashboard that they created for themselves. They just used Excel to put this together to track their observations of their principals' practice. Along the left were elements of their definition of principals' instructional leadership that they were tracking over time. And every time they got together with their principals, they would populate that grid with various observational data about their principals' engagement in such instructional leadership activities as working well with their own data to assess teaching quality. As one superintendent recently reflected to me about the importance of having multiple sources of evidence and evidence of practice, this person said, "Many in my community look at the high test scores in this region of our district and assume there's no problem because test scores are high. But I go into those classrooms and the students aren't truly learning. They're not truly problem solving. The rigor isn't there. That's because the teachers aren't teaching powerfully and principals aren't leading in ways that help them." And the superintendent went on to reflect that he wouldn't see that kind of true experience of student learning if he weren't focused not on test scores, but on evidence of adults' professional practice. So in terms of measures, ILDs we associated with positive results were working with a clear definition of the principalship as instructional leadership and multiple data sources about principals' practice. They were also working from at least their own clear conception of their role as a teacher of principals, and they consulted multiple data sources to understand the extent to which they were being successful in realizing their own targets. For example, in one district, across interviews, we picked up significant conflict among ILDs and between ILDs and their supervisors, and the conflict was over the role of the ILDs in supporting principals. Some felt that ILDs should operate more as teachers. Others felt that ILDs should operate more as traditional assistant superintendents, for example. Several ILDs broke through this conflict by developing their own definition of success, which they measured in terms of the quality of the learning experience they created for principals. They consulted multiple data sources to inform their thinking about how well they were working, and these data sources included principal feedback and included their own observations of principals' progress, their reflections on what they were actually doing day to day compared to their plans for what they meant to do day to day, and they consulted with their colleagues about how they were handling certain situations. The clear role definition and regular consultation with multiple sources of evidence about their practice provided essential anchors for their work, helping to keep them focused on the right work and continuously improving their practice. By contrast, other ILDs who didn't work in this performance management kind of way tended to get sidetracked with other demands. And as each academic year wore on, we observed that they spent less time working with their principals. Several particular supports helped ILDs work with data in these ways. As I've already suggested, clear definitions of roles, both for principals and ILDs, were essential, as were multiple sources of data about practice. So not just test scores, but ongoing detailed information about what adults in the system were doing that might help explain both test scores and other measures of student learning. In addition, ILDs really struggled when they didn't have systems for tracking and analyzing their data over time. And that Excel spreadsheet I mentioned is one simple example of how ILDs were able to, at least some ILDs were able to create a display for themselves to track information over time in a way that helped them actually use it. We also observed the importance of professional development to helping ILDs track and analyze data over time and figure out how to use it to improve their practice. Not all professional development seemed useful in this regard. The professional development we did associate with supporting ILDs' use of data is what we call case-based coaching. And we call it case-based coaching because typically those sessions started with concrete examples of principles and situations principals were in that ILDs were trying to work through, and the presentation by ILDs of various kinds of evidence about the cases. And then ILDs would sit together with each other and sometimes with outside support providers to think through the case and help the ILD check themselves about what they were doing and if what they were doing was likely to lead to improved results. Much like coaches of sports teams review game footage to analyze what's been happening and what they might do differently, these ILDs sat down with examples of principles and kind of a play-by-play of moves they were making and consulted with their colleagues for feedback. It also seemed to matter how these meetings were facilitated. If the facilitator was an internal central office staff person or external. We found much more engagement by ILDs in the professional development when it was run by capable district leaders rather than members of outside organizations who were on contract to provide that kind of professional development. So with these learning-focused partnerships, what these transforming central offices were doing was wrapping supports around principals where they lived, very close to them, providing intensive professional development, both in their school buildings, but also in professional learning communities among principals. But the redesign and alignment of the rest of the central office was essential to truly realizing improved supports for principals. Consider what it would be like to be an ILD trying to help principals become better instructional leaders when your human resources department's hiring and evaluation standards are not on the same page with the work you're doing with your principals, or when the curriculum instruction unit is providing professional development services that are out of sync with the work you're doing with your principals, or when the budget department and buildings and grounds are pulling principals away from the instructional work you're trying to get them to focus on. So it wasn't simply enough for districts to create these ILD principal partnerships. They also understood that the performance of the rest of the central office was essential to realizing improved supports for principals. What this redesign and alignment of the rest of the central office looked like varied by central office unit. So let me just give you one brief example of what this could look like. For example, the curriculum and instruction units that we looked at before the transformation process were characterized by some particular problems that concerned district leaders. For one, they were administering programs largely based on funding rather than trying to provide services that were likely to realize results. There was little coherence across staff or synergies across staff. So math coaches were doing their thing. The literacy program was operating on its own track. Very little connection among the work staff were doing to support instruction. And the staff were operating with virtually no data about how well they were performing. During the transformation process, leaders challenged themselves to provide only those services they thought they would matter to performance. In the curriculum and instruction example, many tried to create what they called a true instructional services function. And this is a function where they created a menu of services likely to realize results. So, for example, they asked themselves, what's the lowest end service we could provide in reading that's likely to actually improve adult capacity in schools? What's the highest end service we can afford to provide, and what can we provide in between? So they built out their services that way, rather than asking the old questions like, what funding do we have, and how are we required to spend this money? So they had new menus of services. ILDs and principals were able to draw on those services to support their professional learning goals, and staff within instructional services units were continuously assessing their own performance. And we saw these ways of working not just in instructional services, but across all units of the central office, including buildings and grounds and nutrition services, for example. Staff figuring out how to align what they were actually doing to support schools and using real data of impact to continuously assess their own performance. And again, in our most well-developed examples, real performance management was essential to what we might call performance-oriented ways of working. And here again, staff were trying to work from multiple data sources. So they were looking at school test scores and what school principals and their ILDs were telling us they liked, what they thought they needed. But they were also looking at raw practice data themselves. So they were looking at information about the quality of teaching. And they were looking at data about the quality of principals' instructional leadership practice, and trying to make sense of all of that information in conjunction with what they knew research was saying about the kinds of professional development, the kinds of supports from different units that could improve results in terms of better adult capacity. Having that kind of practice data in combination with the other sources proved essential. Staff also needed different kinds of supports to be able to use those data. In the districts that we've looked at, relationships between the instructional leadership directors and central office units were really essential, especially in districts that don't yet have good systems for collecting, for example, school-level practice data to use to inform their work. In the absence of those systems, staff in instructional services units and in human resources units really relied on instructional leadership directors to provide them with information about the quality of teaching and principals' instructional leadership practice. One tool that several districts used to help staff work well with data to inform their own performance were what these systems called scorecards. These were descriptions of the key services that different units were trying to provide, the standard to which they were measuring the quality of those services, and whatever data they had available to them at that time to measure their progress toward their goals. And they continuously revisited these scorecards to reflect on the quality of their work. Developing those scorecards using what we call theory of action principles seemed especially important. For example, in some systems that we're in that say they have scorecards, staff are simply asked, what would it mean for you to perform at a high level? And that input is taken for granted, and then staff track their progress toward those measures. By using a theory of action approach, staff were encouraged to think through, okay, what is the right level of performance that I need to hit in order to meaningfully contribute to how this system is supporting results in school buildings? And if they couldn't make a connection between what they wanted to do and the improvement of results in schools, then their own supervisors encouraged them to keep thinking about what would be a truly meaningful measure of their performance, a measure that they could actually tie to the improvement of results in schools. We also saw in case after case how staff needed what we call opportunities for sense-making. For example, in one district that we studied, the nutrition services unit was notoriously poor performing according to school principals. That unit received the worst scores on their principal satisfaction survey, and various other data sources were all pointing toward nutrition services is doing a terrible job. But the director of nutrition services, even when looking at those data, said, there's nothing more we can do. We couldn't possibly work better. What principals want to do with food is inappropriate or illegal, and we just have to tell them no. And if telling them no is why we're receiving poor ratings, then we're just going to have to live with no. But through some intense conversations with her supervisor, the director of nutrition services realized, we do actually have to say no to certain uses of food, for example, or certain ways that people want to relax safety requirements. But we can problem solve with principals. We can say, no, but maybe you could consider this adjustment to what you want to do. Or maybe you could put this safeguard in place instead of the other one. And it was through that ongoing dialogue with her supervisor that she was able to think through new ways of working that actually significantly improved her relationship with school principals and also demonstrably improved the quality of the work they were doing on behalf of schools. One central office leader explained that these opportunities for sense-making were what truly tipped the scales in her district from a long-standing culture of blaming people for bad performance to supporting people to perform better. And this is how she put it. She said, "One of the problems with the old central office was the lack of being data-driven. The lack of being data-driven fueled a sense that nothing was working, and it really created a culture of blame. But the more we have data to tell our story about, well, here's how we're really doing, and you can perceive it however you want, but here's what the data say. When you do that, what actually happens is you start changing your perceptions of people. So that's why I'm training my managers on how to do that and be very data-driven and be almost like a coach of a baseball team that's using their stats all the time." So we've talked about these learning-focused partnerships, and we've also talked about shifting the rest of the central office to be more performance-oriented. Probably not surprisingly, new kinds of leadership throughout the central office were really essential to realizing these new ways of working. We found across districts of all different sizes that were moving on these central office transformation ideas that leaders didn't position themselves as the experts or as the main drivers of the work. Rather, they were continuously modeling that they themselves were learning what the work needed to be, even as they were trying to teach staff how to do it. And in the process, they were really cultivating leadership throughout the central office. For example, in one district that we were in, for years, school principals would tell us that the human resources analyst that you wanted to make sure you got was Judy Smith. And I call this the Judy Smith problem, because even though everyone knew Judy Smith was the best HR analyst, no one ever asked Judy Smith, "Hey, what are you doing that's actually making a difference for principals? And could you teach others how to get better at their own work, maybe using you as a guide?" But through the transformation process, leaders were thinking like teachers. They were trying to identify people throughout the central office who could teach others how to work better. And through that process, this HR analyst had opportunities to document the work she was doing and share it with others. Again, in our most well-developed examples, real performance management was essential to being able to lead in these ways. The leaders in these systems were drawing on multiple sources of evidence. For instance, in the example of the HR analysts, they were drawing on their own conversations with principals and instructional leadership directors about which supports from the HR unit were working for them and which weren't. They sought out input from their own staff about what staff were learning about ways of working that were more or less supportive of instruction in classrooms. And they were in buildings themselves. So by now, I hope you're hearing some familiar themes. One of them is multiple measures of progress are essential to these new ways of working. In addition, so are particular kinds of supports. For example, we heard before about the importance of relationships to staff accessing the data they need to improve their performance. The same is true when it comes to the leadership of this kind of work. Relationships between superintendents and instructional leadership. The same is true when it comes to the leadership of this kind of work. Relationships between superintendents and instructional leadership directors, between chief academic officers and principals, were essential for them to have the information they needed to inform how they were leading the work. Likewise, these leaders benefited from having some kind of system for tracking their ongoing learning, for tracking the data they collected over time. And so the routine documentation, as well as the presentation of what they were learning, was really essential to the work. And one of the strategies that many leaders used successfully in their efforts was a theory of action. It was a way of kind of laying out what their strategies were for central office improvement, but also for tracking indicators that they were making progress along the different dimensions of their plans. Building out these performance management systems was not easy for any of the central offices that we've studied or worked with. And this is true of large urban systems as well as districts with just a handful of central office staff. And there are a few challenges we find districts typically run into when they try to build out the kinds of performance management systems we're outlining here today. For one, all of these systems depend on well-defined conceptions of the kinds of central office work that are likely to support schools. But central office support for schools, especially for teaching and learning, is relatively new work for central offices, and many staff simply don't know and really shouldn't be expected to know what their work needs to be day to day to improve supports for improved teaching in schools. So the lack of definition of successful central office work practice is a major challenge for systems who want to move toward better performance. Second, as I mentioned at the outset, too many districts lack relevant data. Again, at best, central offices are getting access to schools' performance on tests, but they're not getting access to the kinds of detailed data about adults' experiences in the system, including their own day-to-day work, that might help them understand what they're doing day to day and how well it's working. So the absence of relevant data is a significant challenge. And third, staff often don't have help with using the data that they have. So, for example, we see some systems making major investments in principal satisfaction surveys. They're starting to keep time logs of how central office staff are spending their time. But so far, they're mainly spending their time generating that information, and they don't yet have the social supports in place or the other kinds of supports in place to help staff move from having data to using it to improve their performance. So what can districts do to move in the kinds of directions that we're talking about here? I'm going to suggest 3 somewhat simple but essential places to start. For one, districts can start by self-assessing. Where are you in relation to the issues that we've talked about today? For example, what's the definition of good central office practice in your system? How clear is it? How relevant is what you're expecting central office staff to do to actually improving teaching and learning in schools? And how meaningful are the definitions of roles to staff themselves? How bought into those roles are they? Second, you might self-assess, how are you measuring central office progress, if you're measuring it at all? If you are measuring it, are your measures clear? Are they relevant to the improvement of teaching and learning? And again, are they meaningful to staff? And third, you might self-assess, what processes do we have for helping central office staff use data to improve? Second, chances are that once you self-assess, you're going to identify major gaps in what you're doing to use data to improve central office performance. This isn't meant to be a shocking criticism. It's just not what central offices typically have had experience with or have built the capacity to do. So chances are, if your district is like so many districts across the country, you are going to have lots of room for growth when it comes to building out performance management systems that can help central office staff perform better. So one important next step to take after you self-assess is to prioritize. Which areas are most important for us to work on first? Third, I always encourage districts not to go it alone. There hasn't been one district that we've studied or worked with that's made progress with these ideas that has not worked with some kind of external partner. External partners can play many essential roles, including facilitating important discussions about which measures you're going to hold yourselves accountable to, what data sources are going to help you know if you're being successful, and how to use those data to help staff improve. But I encourage you to consider the strategic use of external partners. Too many districts I see are turning the building of performance management over almost entirely to external partners. But there's no way these outsiders know your system and the ins and outs of how things work, and what data are going to be meaningful to the staff that you have. So we always encourage districts, based on what we've seen, to use external partners to supplement or to support their own internal leadership of the work. What kind of support might you look for from an external partner? Well, the next slide shares some resources that we at the District Leadership Design Lab are trying to make available to districts around performance management. And I share this with you, one, so you can know what resources we're making available, but also so you might consider what organizations closer to you might be able to provide you with these kinds of supports. So one of the things that you might look to us or to others for are what we call research-based designs or ideas to inform the development of your central office improvement initiative. We try to develop designs or ideas that are research-based in part because we want to help districts work from what we consider is the best of what we know about what central offices do to improve performance and to design from there. Second, you might look to external partners for tools to help you work with performance data over time. The kinds of tools you might look for include those that provide you with a sense of processes you can use with staff to develop with them meaningful measures of their performance. You might also look for instruments for measuring performance, such as the scorecards that I mentioned. Additionally, tools that might be helpful to your development of performance management systems include those that provide strategies for looking at multiple measures of practice changes over time. And third, another role an external partner can play is to help you with facilitation of the sometimes challenging conversations about what your work should be, how to measure it, and how well it's going, for example. But whatever kind of facilitation you are able to access, we encourage you to choose a partner who can help you build your internal leadership capacity for driving this work.